Welcome to Elevating Consciousness, the podcast that brings you mind-expansive conversations into the heart of what matters most. I'm your host, Artem, and our guest today is Dr. John Churchill, a psychologist, Dharma teacher, and the founder of Planetary Dharma, an integrally informed community embracing the vows and path of the Bodhisattva, committed to elevating human consciousness and collective transformation. John holds a doctorate in clinical psychology from William James College and is also a practitioner of traditional Chinese medicine. His journey into Buddhist psychology began as a monk at Samye Ling Monastery in Scotland, where he undertook an in-depth study of Buddhist contemplative practice. He later spent 15 years training and teaching Great Seal Mahamudra meditation within the Indo-Tibetan Mahayana lineage under the mentorship of Dr. Daniel P. Brown. John is a founding member of the Integral Institute, led by transpersonal philosopher Ken Wilber, and has received advanced training in attachment therapy, hypnosis, positive psychology for peak performance, and the pointing out style of Mahamudra meditation. He's also the author of Becoming Buddha, Buddhist Contemplative Psychology in a Western Context. For the past 25 years, John has been developing what he calls the Fourth Turning Planetary Dharma, a full-spectrum, psychospiritual approach that integrates the great Indo-Tibetan traditions within psychodynamic healing and adult development. In this episode, we discuss the vision of a fourth turning Dharma, John's differences with his teacher Dan Brown, navigating the traditional versus progressive polarity in spirituality, connecting to sacred world, moving into the trans-rational, the role of psychedelics on the spiritual path, and so much more. Enjoy. Dr. John Churchill, welcome to the show.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for welcoming me.
Yeah, for sure. Thanks a lot for coming on. And I want to set up some context before we begin. You've been on my radar for a little while, and recently a few of my past guests on this podcast have mentioned you as someone who's doing some of the leading edge work in the Dharma world. And it was cool to learn that you've come from the lineage of Dan Brown, as he was also my teacher briefly before he passed away. And currently my main meditation teacher is Dustin DePerna, another senior student of Dan Brown's. And I also read your thesis, which I really enjoyed. I found it to be a remarkably comprehensive elucidation of Buddhism and developmental theory. And given that I've been standing in the same stream of wisdom for several years now, I was curious to get a taste of your approach. And I had an opportunity to participate in your Introduction to Planetary Dharma course this past month. And there are many threads I want to explore today, but maybe we could start with you giving an overview of your vision of Planetary Dharma. And perhaps it would even be helpful for you to unpack the earlier turnings of the Dharma and then share what you believe a fourth turning entails and why it's necessary.
Okay. Just some little questions.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what do we mean by the fourth turning, so to speak? Well, even that term, first, second, third, fourth turning, has to be contextualized within a certain school of Buddhism, right, so to speak. So within that Mahayana school, the first turning relates to coming to understand the nature of personal suffering, right? Particularly through understanding cause and effect. Right? So that which is a pretty. If you think of complexity, it's not too complicated. It's like if you do bad things happen. And if you do good things happen. So do less bad things and more good things, and guess what happens? Right? You feel better and better. That's the kind of the first turning. The second turning, you could think of it a little bit more around maybe like a systemic kind of cognition, which looks at the same question, but through a different way of thinking. And you could say that it sees the issue of human suffering more from a perspective of closed and open systems, or what was called in Buddhist philosophy emptiness, but I don't think that's a very good translation, or very good, particularly just the nature of Western thought. So it's really around the recognition of the deep interdependency or deep relationality, right? And that suffering is caused by a lack of understanding, living, and recognizing that depth of relationality. I think that's pretty easy, basic way of saying it. And then the third turning continues on that, but is really, let's say, holonic, if you will, in its way of thinking, and it looks at the wholeness, and that actually it isn't so much about cause and effect. That's true, and yes, it's true about systems, but what's also true is reality is a single whole, that we are wholes, and it's the lack of recognition of that holiness, of that whole nature, that causes fundamental suffering. And basically, of course, really, all of these transcend and include, they're stacked on top of one another. And so what's the fourth turning? Well, the fourth turning is really what we would call process practice, meaning once you understand and you realize those perspectives to some degree, the fourth turning in some ways is about coming back from emptiness into form, but really understanding form from the perspective of time and the time that we live in. So really what a fourth turning is about synthesis, the synthesis of all bodies of knowledge of a particular culture into that wisdom stream. So there was a fourth turning in Tibet, and that was the integration of their understanding of medicine and architecture and relationality and ethics, right? So in that sense, a fourth turning is in some ways more related. It's related to culture and time, right? How does, let's say, geometry, music and mathematics, aesthetics, ethics and science all integrate into a single holonic body of knowledge? So that's really the fourth turning. So in that sense, it's the Dharma version of the civilizational hologram. It's like, what are all the pieces? How do they all fit together in such a way that you can boot up Dharma civilization? So this is where you get mandalas and all of that aspect of, let's say, sacred science is particularly an expression of the fourth turning.
Yeah, and perhaps this is good to mention too, is like you could line up each turning with like the Hinayana, Mahayana, Vajrayana, right? Like that aligns with those expressions of Buddhism. And so I'm curious about really this distinction between the third and the fourth, and like, because it does seem like Vajrayana was very expansive. Like the Vajrayana method is very expansive. It emphasizes, like Mahamudra is known as like the householder path, for example. So it seems like it really emphasizes stepping into the world. And also from my understanding, I think you wrote about this, like, it wasn't just about meditating for monks or anybody who's practicing Vajrayana, is also learning these other aspects, these other sciences. So what exactly, can you speak more to exactly what was missing? I'm hearing you speaking about time and like the time we're in now, and obviously time changes. So there could be certain expression of Vajrayana that was emerging at a certain time. This is a different time now, but yeah, can you speak more to this like distinction between third and fourth?
It's about well, on one level, it's about complexity, meaning the third turning or the teachings on Buddha nature aren't particularly complex. They don't have the tech to integrate all the other bodies of knowledge into them. That's really the difference. It's really, let's say, particularly related to love wisdom as a realization, but it isn't. It doesn't include the ability to synthesize the whole of the psyche. What do I mean by that? Well, if you look at the path from a developmental perspective, let's say the path of the Bodhisattva, the way I see it is that the fourth turning is particularly related to a certain kind of developmental operating system, if you will, that particularly draws upon what they call in the Buddhist tradition direct, non-conceptual, valid cognition, which is essentially a kind of way of knowing that is direct. And like you could call it intuition, but that can mean a number of different things. It means technically, particularly with like abstract capacities, that and from a kind of a cosmological perspective, God, this is getting complex super quickly, but you wanted to go there? Okay. So there's a level of your being, we could call it the soul. So the fourth turning, perhaps you could say, focuses a little bit more on the soul. It's not that the other turnings don't, but the soul, or the Sambhogakaya, as the central organizing principle. So let's say within some cosmologies, that's understood to be like the fourth plane, so to speak. It is the central within our own psychology, the soul, if you will, or the heart mind is the center. It is the very center. That heart mind is holonic. What do I mean by that? Well, it's toroidal, and it has a particular kind of way of operating that is in synchrony and resonance with both, let's say, the planet itself and the solar system and so on and so forth. Meaning that there's a way of orienting the path that aligns you with the unfolding of the whole of the universe in its relative aspect, in its timing. That is not what the focus so much of the second and the third turnings is. It's really, so the fourth turning is closely related to time and timing and synchronizing with time, but also understanding like the timing and unfolding mechanisms of your own psyche. Because you can apply philosophical precepts from the view of the ego. Like you can try and make something happen. You can apply Dzogchen, you can apply Mahamudra, you can apply any number of yogic techniques from the perspective of the ego. And it's very, very, very common. What the fourth turning is also pointing to is there's a different way of setting up the whole operating system based on a holonic, fractal, resonant field model that is different on the relative side than how the third and second and first turnings see things.
Yeah, so the way this is landing for me is that there is even more of a stepping into our humanity and also maybe understanding the fractal nature of existence, like more of these fractals and more aspects of existence.
It's also alchemical, Artem, meaning if you want to transform a whole world system, if you want to transform a whole world system, you need to have a science that sees both individual psychology and the developmental unfolding of that whole world system as being inseparable. You need an approach that understands that the world that we're all perceiving is also partially due to the particular, let's say, frequencies that the whole of humanity is tuned to. So in that sense, you could think fourth turning is about then tuning the whole thing up.
Yeah, like this also makes me think about like astrology and this notion of planets and like how the planets, and maybe we could touch on that because I think there's a lot of what you speak to is like the trans-rational and what role that plays in kind of our development as people and as a culture. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. But I also want to kind of speak a little bit to my experience kind of participating in your 3-day course. And, I want to highlight what I found to be unique and different from other meditation retreats that I've done. And, you guys use a lot of music, and you even had a whole Planetary Dharma curated playlist, which I think brings an element of fun and aliveness, which can be really missing in usually like meditation retreats. There was also a strong emphasis on visualization that I noticed in many of the meditations. You were really descriptive in mentioning different plants, animals, and just weaving this mandala of deep interconnection, which I also found to be unique. I haven't heard those kind of meditations before. And despite the retreat being online, you invited us to imagine that we were sitting together in a circle and to visualize tendrils reaching out from and towards everyone. And we also did several laying down practices and worked with things like mudras and gestures. And finally, something you kept coming back to was this emphasis on the heart, which does exist in some approaches, but can be missing in others. Can you speak to some of these elements and how you see them coming together in the Planetary Dharma approach?
Sure. Well, let's just start with, let's say, from the perspective of what are called the completion stage practices, which are like the alchemical practices. Of course, part of the problem, not only from, let's say, from the perspective of these other approaches, we've experienced multi-generational trauma that's affected kind of the effect of causality. It's affected our relational capacity. It's affected our sense of wholeness. Okay, that's all fine. From the kind of fourth turning perspective and alchemical perspective, that's also conditioned all of your senses. So what that means is actually, and quite literally, so how do you recondition the senses? Well, the first thing is there's a big difference between understanding, let's say right now, you and I and our listeners, and how we're perceiving the world right now. There's a tendency, because of the nature of how perception is being conditioned, to see it as objects out there. Okay? And that's also what that does, is how you see the world or how you imagine it to be. It's related to the imaginal level, or what the old esotericists would call the astral level. Leo, behave. And so it's very different. So this has got to do with your self-image. Like right now, is your self-image, do you have 10,000 tendrils connecting everything and everyone? Before I said that. Now, if you didn't, then you're deluded. Because actually, that's how the self is energetically. So it isn't just, if you just practice Mahamudra and Dzogchen without also addressing and the imaginal level, what happens is you get a really enlightened asshole. Okay? Because it doesn't necessarily change the self-image. You're always going to have a self-image. And just recognizing the holonic nature of everything, but you still have an operating system. You still have an energetic operating system. And no matter if you shift your basis of operation, if you still imagine yourself and believe yourself to have a certain energetic configuration, well, then that's what you have. Right. So now that has to be reconfigured. There's no avoiding that. There was a big argument in Tibet around like the quick path, so to speak, right? And the more graduated path. And the graduated path won out. One of the dangers that I've seen, particularly, let's say, in the integral world, is actually not having a depth of understanding of Buddhism, and a kind of like arrogance of running to the highest practices and not understanding all of the other practices that would have fit in. And then if you do understand them, you have to be able to translate them into what does that mean for us as Westerners, right? So deity yoga or archetypal yoga or Maha yoga in the Nyingma or Utapanakrama, like generation stage, completion stage, all of that actually has a really important place in addressing other dimensions of our being. Because actually, it's also possible developmentally to, let's say, score high on an ego development test, if you will, but the self-image is still a kind of Western self-image and hasn't really been, let's say, informed by those shamanic realms, which are they're real realms. So the importance of envisionment, of visualization, is not so much to generate anything as it is to counteract the fact that right now we're all visualizing unconsciously that things aren't a certain way. Right? So that degree of engagement with the psyche is maybe more aligned with a kind of a Jungian understanding of the personal and collective unconscious. My mentor, Dr. Dan, was not so good with that level of the psyche. That really wasn't his. He didn't really relate to that very well. So the visualization practice is really about addressing that dimension of the psyche, right? The imaginal, which is a very real realm. And that particularly becomes important like after death, because that realm is as structured as this realm, right? And also from one extent, actually, the question is, from one perspective is, well, are you here trying to get there? Or are you actually there trying to blossom into here? And those perspectives are related, they're related a lot to the self-image, right? And how you imagine and envision yourself to be. Because it can shift all kinds of dynamism that words can't shift. So yes, visualization, but behind it is a kind of deeper appreciation of also a kind of like, what are all these practices about, and what are we trying to do, right? Because how you envision it, right? How all of our listeners right now, how you imagine your practice, meaning you might have studied philosophy and you might have done body practices and all of that, but at some level, you're imagining how the path unfolds. Does that make sense? So that's really right. Imagination is actually a really important dimension of practice.
Yeah, this is reminding me of Rob Berbea. He had a handful of talks. It was something like Questioning Awakening. And he was basically talking about, he was given like different Buddhist teachers, and he's like, look at like this person's expression of awakening. It's very different than this person's expression of awakening. And he was really big on the imaginal realm. And I actually had, I'm not sure if you're familiar with Tom Cheatham, but he talks about the imaginal realm. I had him on a previous podcast. And like I can see how like all this visualization and the practices you're doing are really tapping into that. and transforming an imagination. Something else you brought up Dan Brown, and this was actually the next question I wanted to ask you, because I haven't really heard you speak about this anywhere, is like your reasoning behind splitting off from Dan Brown's lineage. Because from my understanding, you were supposed to be his successor, and then it seems like you decided to do your own thing. You mentioned the unconscious stuff, so maybe there's something there. But what were some of the drivers behind the decision, and perhaps some ways of seeing things differently than Dan?
Well, first thing is I have infinite respect for the old salty dog, and and as I haven't really spoken about these things in public. So what I will say is Dan was my teacher. He was also my teaching. We worked together. I don't think starting in 2004 to 2018, 19. And that included a decade of sharing offices together.
Wow.
What can I say? I think that, there's both a personal thing here and a theoretical. So maybe I'll stay away from the personal.
Fair enough. Yeah.
But theoretically, there are certain dimensions to the Dharma that Dan particularly related to embodiment, affect. I mean, just so you know, I did a doctoral. I did 5 years of doctoral work whilst working with Dan. So not only did he train me in all of what he had for Buddhism, but also Dan had 40 years of being a world's leading psychologist. And actually, that's where his major genius was. So that's in the realm of attachment, in the realm of hypnosis. So I think, what I learned from Dan was how to think about contemplative practices like an engineer. So he thought he was teaching me what to do, but I was studying how you do it. So I was studying how he put together what he put together, not what it is he put together. Because yes, what it is that he managed to synthesize was genius, but actually, if you want to learn to teach, if you just study what, then you're going to learn to teach somebody else's. And if you learn how, then you're going to actually be able to go deeper, which I think is important. It's important that really, as an integrally informed person who appreciated that, every teacher is going to teach a system that in some ways is an expression of their own psychology. Until you get to a point where a teacher has an integral cognition and is aware of that, and therefore starts to try to build a system that takes that into consideration. So that was, I had also a close relationship with Ken Wilber. I was back in 99, I was the first employee of Integral Institute. So I've been studying Ken's material and Dan's material since I was 16. Right. So coming to the table there to work with Dan was, yes, to study what he was doing, but also how he went about doing it, because he had a very unique, it's the best of Western formal operational cognition, just really brilliant, rational mind, applying to these contemplative systems. And there's nobody, I haven't seen nobody who has that kind of an engineer's mind. He really had an amazing engineer's mind. But let's say he wasn't so good thinking systemically or meta-systemically or even paradigmatically. For instance, Dan was like, let's keep psychology is over here, Dharma is over here, right? And brilliant with his psychology over here and brilliant with his Dharma over here, but he was like, well, these are different. And the truth is like in my own work and my own understanding, even coming to study work with Dan, was that was not how I saw things. I've been particularly influenced when I was young by the work of Almas. I really, Muhammad Ali and the Diamond Approach and the depth of integration and understanding like psychodynamics and states and that. So I think in some ways, Dan didn't have that part of the tradition. So he was much more Freudian than he was Jungian, so to speak, and liked to keep things separate because that's how well his mind worked. And I guess the gift that I had is like showing up with a master who had kept things separate and distinct so that I could study them in their context. But that really wasn't my job. My job was to like, okay, how do we take this further on? How does this work with what does the integrated human being look like? And that wasn't Dan wanted to keep, he was like, let's keep this is separate. And also I think the other piece is Dan was majorly grounded in Tibetan Buddhism. And yes, I had been majorly grounded in that as well. I'd spent time as a Tibetan Buddhist monk but I had also a lot of study in, let's say, Jung, and alchemy, and Western esotericism, and other forms of Eastern esotericism and yoga, I had a degree in acupuncture, so I was coming with a different kind of frame. And he, at some point in the relationship, it was like, okay, you're my teacher, but now we need to collaborate. Now this needs to become a collaborative process because actually I have a lot to offer this. And he was unable to make that transition, which was extremely painful. And I think, and that's where the personal stuff is. But
yeah. No, I appreciate you because I haven't heard you speak about this. And, I think it's really challenging to, you want to respect somebody who's your teacher and teaches you all these things, and you want to be respectful and have respect. But then it's challenging sometimes to challenge them or to go a separate way or to be like, well, I disagree with this and I see things a different way. So I can definitely see how that's a difficult thing. And
that generation, Artem, just generationally has done a really bad job on succession, really bad job. And I think part of planetary Dharma, frankly, I was always also like looking at the whole lifespan, which is a fourth turning thing. And like, okay, how do we pass this down? How does this go all the way down to the children? How do you pass it?
Hand it off. Yeah.
How do you hand it off? And you should always be handing it off. You should always work out, like, how do you hand it off as quickly as possible? Because there's something else for you to do. And that Dan wasn't the first of, now granted, I think part of the turning of the wheel is we have to appreciate that generation had to be very hard-headed because they didn't have any elders. And they had to fucking take up the backpack and go into the jungle and hack their way through. And I'm sure that my students will, actually, I really hope that we've worked this out a little bit, that it's not as bad, right? But I think that there was a degree of just like the necessity of those ego structures to just really be like tough.
Yeah.
As an archetypal, even as an astrological thing, right? And you have to be able to look at yourself, step back and see your function, but also see what other people's function is within the wheel of the Dharma, because within the mandala of sacred world, right, each generation in some ways, from a kind of generational astrological perspective, has a function within the tissues of the collective psyche, right? So there is the collective psyche, if you will, has tissues, it has layers, and we all perform certain functions. So appreciating that actually that this is a multi-generational effort, and not getting so stuck in hero mode, right? Hero mode is really important, but I think that what's changed in our generation is in Dan and Ken's generation, like the superhero movies, it was like Batman or Superman or whatever. But now, in our generations, it was like the Avengers with like 10 different storylines of 10 different heroes. Very different mythic structure when you begin to realize that there's more than one. You're not the only hero, and that part of your duty is also to recognize the other heroes and help facilitate, building the Avengers or whatever that mythic. Yeah.
Yeah. It seems like you're speaking to this element of time, and like there's a specific time, like what time is it? And there was a specific time in history and culture that every generation has to play. And, that time, like the hero archetype was like the dominant, like, pull yourself up by the bootstraps, get things done. I mean, you see this with like, Tibetans getting exiled. You could imagine that kind of movement, like what they had to go through, what they had to embody. And now you see kind of like other archetypes waking up, and it's not all about the hero. And there's actually a limitation to the hero archetype and the limitation to what is conscious. And I think that's also like you speaking about the unconscious. There's all these other aspects that are not just about ego strength.
That's right. So again, like Dan was, he was a father to me, and a mentor, and yet as best, we weren't able to work it out. And that happens sometimes in these stories. And actually, the thing is because of that, I had all of the freedom. Now, granted, it didn't end well, and Dan said lots of nasty things about me, and I kept my mouth shut because I didn't want to say anything about, I just didn't want to get into that. But it did free me from having to just basically he just wanted for me to just teach cookie cutter.
Yeah. So I feel like maybe this is relevant. Like what you're saying now is relevant to this other question and that I also had. And, it seems to me that the same dynamic we see in politics between, let's say, conservative and progressive movements also shows up in spirituality. And like on one extreme, there's like a very rigid traditional expression of spirituality, like what you might find in some monasteries. And on the other, there's like a la carte new age approach where you just, put whatever you want on your plate and discard the rest. And personally, I'm drawn to approaches that fall somewhere in the middle, and that include, I would include planetary Dharma and as well as Dustin DePerna's Riggs. They're both beautiful approaches to Dharma. And, even within these more balanced middle ground approaches, it's not like there's some perfect still point. There can still be a leaning towards being more conservative and protective of tradition, or more progressive and questioning of tradition.
Depends what you mean by tradition. What do you mean by, like, I think that even inside that conversation, let's take, like, what do you actually mean by that? Because do you mean just doing things this way because that's the way that it's done? But that's not the scientific method. So then I'm like, yes. Okay, like that is not, this polarity, I think let's even like, I think the scientific method comes in here as well. Like, it's not just about do whatever. It's like, well, based on, let's say, the evidence, right? And based on, I'll give you an example, right? So part of my work was interviewing students So I'd interview the students for 1 hour once a month, right? So I would 5 students, 7 students a day, 1 hour. And I did that for a decade. Now, there's a certain body of evidence that you gain in understanding what's going on with the mind. There's a certain which isn't the same thing. So when you're informed by that body of knowledge, then you can make informed choices as to how you turn things. Now, whenever you turn something one way, you're going to lose something on one side. I mean, that's pretty evident. It's more also got to do with just how you're going to construct the nature of the path. Meaning what needs to happen for the psyche before you get things really, really tight. Because there is a time for things to get really, really narrow. But you have to be careful when you do that, because when you lock that in too early, you can. So let's say creativity and dogmatism, which is right. But there's also, I think there's also this, I think it's far too simplistic, Artem. I think that if this was in the academy, right? So if we don't have that academy yet, but imagine a whole department in Harvard on contemplative science, right? And understanding the brain states and understanding how they affect the psyche and the body, and also understanding developmental psychology and what needs to happen where. The idea of creativity versus tradition, that isn't part of science. What's part of science is it true and does it work? Right? So I've never viewed, even my Dzogchen mentor, Raha Brahmache, he's always said to me, listen, this is a science. Right? It's a science. Now, yes, in science, you can have dogmatism, but I think it's a little early for us to have dogmatism in contemplative science when it's probably only 30 years old or something.
Yeah, I guess when I'm thinking about this, these polarities, it's how much do you change the practice, right? And it's not going to be nothing, right? Because it's people change, time changes, every student is different. So it's as a good teacher, you're going to adjust the practices. But there could also be this notion of changing things too quickly or mixing too many things. And I feel this separating, this notion of separating, which you were speaking to, which really makes sense. I could kind of see that same thing in Rigzin, where it's it's very much focused on awakening. It's very much informed also by attachment and these other things. And there's a outsourcing of here are therapists and other people you could work with to figure out these other aspects. But it's very much focused on pointing out, right? But it seems you integrate a lot more elements into actually the Sangha, into actually planetary Dharma. You bring more things in and you bring more of it feels to me the meditations in Rigzin, they're more they're more connected to exactly what Dan was doing. It's very similar to Dan's pointing out, where my sense is your meditations are now moving a little further away and integrating more of your sense of what you see as being that.
That's true.
That's just my sense.
Yeah. Look, you did a weekend, right? So that's the
yeah. I don't want to act like I.
What I meant by that, Artem, is that the way that I look at it is this is a 30 or 40 year journey. Okay. So what I saw with Dr. Dan as my friend, when I first started working with Dan, and he was doing one retreat a year with 10 people in the retreat. So I'm also watching the effects of the practice that he designed on himself, on him, and that throttling, okay, right, there are other processes that are part of the Dharma than just that. It wouldn't take much work for me to put together retreats like that. But that wasn't what I was solving for. I was solving for what I saw happened to Dan in terms of his own development and psychology from doing the practices the way that he did. That's right. So, what I'm interested in doing is trying to build for decades. And so part of that is also, how many texts do you think there are in the Tibetan tradition that even Dan translated that asked and addressed the effect of practices over a lifetime, or when to fit them into a lifetime? None. So the question of what it is that we need to do first, so stepping back and understanding, let's say, not rushing the Bodhisattva psychology piece. And I know that Dan rushed that. And so I don't want that to be rushed. And we could get arguments about that, but look, I was there. I saw what was going on. I saw it growing from a little circle to what it grew into. And I was looking and saying, okay, well, if we're going to try and do something on this civilization in a big way, and granted, Planetary Dharma, I still have limited resources, so it's not like I can do everything that needs to be done right now. But yes, there is a place for these very intense, focused kind of practices, but they have to sit inside of a developmental operating system. And so my concern was okay, let's just go back and help the students build that. Because awakening, there's so many different kinds of awakening in the tradition. I think that this was the challenge. Dan just took, let's say, Mahamudra and Dzogchen psychology, okay? But there's a whole other corpus of psychology there. So knowing, so I think that, let's say 30 years from now, this kind of separation that I don't think I think it's going to work itself out. If I and if Dustin do it right, it will, but you got to start somewhere, right? So you can start by going let's go with awakening, or let's go to the base, and that there's just different ways of approaching the challenge that we have.
Yeah, I guess there's one more thread to this is, you mentioned during, I think somebody asked you a question, do you need to function from a Tibetan Buddhist lens to work with planetary Dharma? And you said no, and that in some sense, we are in a process of transitioning out of Tibetan Buddhism and into what you're calling sacred humanism. And I think that's part of also the debate is there's people that believe that certain traditions, right? Tibetan Buddhism, certain aspects of Christianity, all these kind of traditions, they want to preserve them. They want them to keep going. And then there's also this kind of maybe pressure for things to kind of come together. And another metaphor I might use is kind of like globalization, and what you have, at one point you have a particular cuisine, right? And then now everything starts coming together. It's all fusion. And it's that particular culture or that particular cuisine stops existing because it's just a melting pot and everything's blending together. So there's this notion of preserving and protecting a particular expression that, somebody that's maybe leaning more into the traditional, that seems to be really important, where somebody that's leaning into the other direction, it's it's not about protecting a particular tradition or expression. It's how do we get the most holistic, integrated expression and what's most useful for the time right now.
Yeah, I think we should save Italian cuisine and Chinese cuisine. Yes, I think I'm a little bit more, let's say, scientific around this. What I mean by that is the world is in a dire situation. And just as the level of integration we're having on the planet is happening, we're also at the level of about to destroy what it is that we have. Not just culturally, I just mean the whole thing. So my primary concern is addressing that the main what we need to do is we need to articulate a psychological science. I don't care about at that level when it comes to like saving your great grandchildren. I don't fucking care if it's Chinese food or Japanese food, right? It needs to. So we need a science, right? Now, what I can tell you from medicine is like you got a liver and a kidney and you have lymph. There's something objective about the psyche, and the body is the psyche. That's also true of the human psyche. So what I'm interested in is what is objectively true about the nature of the human psyche, developmentally, how it unfolds, and what the various dimensions of it are, and then what are all the approaches to that across history. Now, I could say that personally, like, there's not a lot of people who can do this kind of work, meaning I've trained for 3 decades to have that capacity. So rather than a smorgasbord, we're talking about the building of a new science. I think that's really important. And of course, understanding all the practices that are part of that science. I think like keeping Greek medicine as a living tradition is great, and Chinese medicine as a living tradition is great. And we need an integrated world medical system that integrates the understanding of vibrational medicine and the whole to reveal the fullness of what it means. So that's in my mind, that is the priority in terms of my priority, right? And also, frankly, I also think in terms of, let's say, for the planetary civilization that wants to be born, that needs to happen. Now then, the next question has got to do with how do we preserve the individuality? Because in some ways that's got about maintaining indigenousness, right? What's the flavor of a local area? Now, I'm not going to speak about how the Tibetans are going to keep their tradition, or the Peruvian is going to keep their tradition. But what I would say is that dimension of the psyche, in my mind, is closely related to the land that we live in, the plants that grow there, the weather, and the animals. So the archetypal nature of what's local. And that's kind of the difference between what's Celtic, if you will, and what's Italian and what's Tibetan. So my interest is in how do we then, let's say, what is that universal shamanism that allows us to drill back down to rediscover what indigenousness is for those of us, because the truth is Tibetan Buddhism, yes, you're right. It's Italian Buddhism, right? It's like, okay, we need to find a Buddhism that is both planetary and also local. So the local piece is getting down into understanding the depth of the body, working with plant medicines, working particularly with the tree medicines of the lands that you are living in. So yes, we have to protect indigenousness, but we also have to rediscover indigenousness. Yes, it's great that some people are keeping alive the Tibetan traditions, and I think it would be best if the Tibetans kept alive their traditions, and that the Westerners, using what our tradition is, which is the scientific method and rationality and analysis, approach the project of what's needed for Westerners, rather than like taking what was needed for Tibetans. We actually ask ourselves what's needed here at this time, and do the hard work necessary of building that.
Yeah, I think what you're speaking to right now is this notion of science and like the scientific approach. And I've heard you, and this is kind of related to this question. It's like I've heard you speak quite a bit about the risk of trying to extract practices from certain traditions while throwing away the cosmology. And I think you've related this to the fact that some people have genuine non-dual experiences and certain awakenings, yet they're disconnected from sacred world. Mm-hmm. So what does it mean to be connected to sacred world? And how can we keep a cosmology intact when it seems to rely on supernatural beliefs or something that could be like counter to the scientific worldview?
How do we do that? What is sacred world? Well, in some ways, we haven't even begun the project to rediscover that. And what I mean by that is in order to address these questions in the way that needs to be addressed, we don't yet actually have the research facility to do that. And what do I mean by that? But I mean that if this was any other field, if this was like an industry, we would have research and development. Okay, there's no research and development in the contemplative field, not to the degree that there needs to be in order to actually address who the hell are we going to become in order not to destroy ourselves. So the first thing is that we haven't had yet the investment in the kind of organization necessary to articulate these things to the degree that I would like to you, right? Like we just don't have that. Okay, so that being said, right, what do we mean by sacred world? Well, the first thing is so many of us as Westerners, let's say, are coming from grounded in formal operational strategic thinking, grounded in a particular modernist worldview. And that's kind of where our center is to some degree. And then we get introduced to, let's say, some of us who went the kind of philosophical or highbrow path, right? Introduced to philosophies related to non-duality, related to liberation and freedom, all of that, right? Sophisticated tech. However, what we didn't realize is that our modernist operating system was suppressing a whole bunch of our own material or developmental stages that have been suppressed for the last, let's say, 2,000 or let's say 5,000 years, right? And so we're building on top of a modernist system. So even paradoxically, when I say science, but I mean a science that understands that and looks up, but also looks down, right? An integral, meta-aware science that recognizes that we have like these prior levels of development that, in my mind, used to be much more operational. So one thing I can tell you from, let's say, how the birth of the rational mind over, let's say, the last 10,000 years. So let's just forget what we know about human history. What I can tell you is that as human rationality increases to some extent, metaphorically, and because I don't have the research to back this up, it dries out the DMT in the brain. So there's a relationship between, no, I'm serious, there's a relationship between the operating system that's running right now, right, this kind of operating system that you and I are doing, and how it affects the alchemical balance of the elements. And in doing so, dries up particular elements, and in doing so cuts you off from access to a much more basic, like, sacred world where, Harper, come here. No? I was going to, like, sacred dogs, right? Like, and plants. Oh, Musha. Like, okay, look at this guy, okay? This dude. So, by sacred world, what happened is the nature of Christianity, amongst others, with its highly dualistic split. So rather than having a full spectrum of color, a chromatic psychology, we're already approaching this from in a very dualistic way, even if we think we're not, because the very chemistry is already like that. So what I mean by sacred world is the full spectrum, the full colors of the sacred. And that means the etheric, right? Like that means the astral. And I don't mean the astral here is just, the imagination. I mean, it is a whole fucking realm of beauty and of horror. But it's mainly a horror because we haven't cleaned it up because we're into the non-dual. We're going way above, and we don't realize that our planetary system, right? We are inseparable from a planetary system. That planetary system, like its physical body right now, is pretty contaminated, right? Its etheric body is fried by, electromagnetic shit. The astral is full of garbage, and we're up there like, the non-dual awareness. So what I mean by sacred world is recognizing that we're that the cosmology of our Tibetan brothers and sisters is a cosmology of a whole planetary system, right? The dhatus, the karma dhatu, for instance, that refers to the desire realm, the astral. Dhatu means tissue. It's a tissue. So we are inseparable from a planetary system. And what the understanding of sacred world is that planetary system functions just like yours does. You have bodies and sheaths and chakras and nadis. So what a fourth turning perspective is it places what we're doing within the context of a much larger system. And then what you're doing matters because it's not about keeping the Tibetan or the Italian tradition, right? Like, I love Tibetan momos, right? But I think the Italians do certain things better. It's not about that. It's about the nature of the whole system and what needs to happen for us to awaken into the wholeness of that. And it's from there that you get color, and you get art, and you get music, and you get dance, and you get like spirituality that we can live in. That's what I mean by sacred world.
Yeah, I mean, if we haven't started going into the trans-rational yet, then let's go down in there now.
Let's go, baby.
Something you mentioned in the course was the notion of the pre-trans fallacy, a concept coined by Ken Wilber that describes how people can confuse magical thinking with genuine transpersonal spiritual experiences. And, it made me think of a conversation you had with Aubrey Marcus and another teacher, Mateos Di Stefano, who talks about remembering past lives and receiving messages from beings on other planets. Personally, I'm unsure how to relate to claims like that. Like, my initial reaction is to dismiss them as magical thinking and to choose not to engage with teachers who make such extraordinary assertions. On the other hand, a more humble stance might be to say something, well, perhaps there are beings who have access to dimensions of reality I don't understand, and even so, I find it difficult to take such claims seriously, partly because it can create a kind of guru or messiah complex around the person making them. And so this question isn't, particularly about Mateus. I only mention him because you've been in a dialogue with him and he's a well-known figure. But more generally, what do you think are wise ways to engage with teachers who make such claims? How might the framing of the pre-trans fallacy help us navigate situations like this? How do we deal with these kind of, these out of world kind of claims and these different kind of pointing to different dimensions and different aspects of experience, you know?
Well, again, I think that the first problem is we don't yet have the right academy to hold all of these things. So the way that I understand it So I think that's the way I understand it, and then the way maybe I would suggest like our listeners understand it. At least for me, I would say that the center of gravity is not so much, let's say, here, but it's more there. And what I mean by that is, well, if you would allow yourself to imagine what a civilization would look and feel like with the best that everything that we have right now. So if we have everything that we have right now integrated the right way, right? So let's say, what are you going to call that? Meta-paradigmatic civilization, based on like what you know now, right? Okay. And that at the heart of that is the academy related to the sacred. And on the ground, what we see is various teachers teaching in various departments of Hogwarts. So first you have to be able to discern what the different departments are. So for instance, those beings who haven't dried themselves up will have a lot better access to the astral, right? And of course, if you can imagine the perspective of those of us who've dried ourselves up tends to be arrogance, right? Like that's the kind of the dryness of the academy. So we also have to recognize there's going to be some of our brothers and sisters who are swimming in waters that we're not swimming because we're at the top of the mountain. So part of it is just recognizing the different dimensions of the academy, different capacities of various teachers. Now, this also goes to the fact of like, how does the academy work? How are you meant to, as a student, relate to teachers? If you're relating to somebody as a guru and you don't even understand what that whole, how the academy understands what a guru is, then you're going to make mistakes, right? The first thing is there's only one teacher, right? The teaching function itself. And so we have to deeply respect that. And of course, that teaching function, you project all your mommy and daddy stuff on that. So if you haven't cleaned that up, you're going to get into mommy daddy stuff with your teacher. That's what we do. So that aside, right? So let's say we've worked through that stuff. So now basically what you have is teachers at Oxford University. It's like Oxford. At Oxford University, you have lecturers, you have tutors, right? You have there's people who will specialize in, like Matthias, in all kinds of astral. He is like, first thing, he refers to himself as a memory cell. Well, if you know anything about Chinese medicine, the memory is directly related to the water element, which is also like, so the memory is related deeply to astral capacity, particularly the kind that he has. But you also have to recognize that if you have a strength in one department, then you're likely perhaps to have slight weaknesses in others. Why? Because even as a teacher, even Matthias hasn't had, let's say, the opportunity to be in the academy where all of these things, all of these rays, all of these qualities could balance themselves out. We don't yet have that. So we're all going to be a little bit imbalanced to the extent that we don't recognize that that's the case. So how do we approach teachers recognizing that? So that's the first thing, right? Second thing is the pre-trans fallacy. Well, the pre-trans fallacy directly relates to, let's say, we don't want to confuse a realm with a level of development that had particular access, a special access to that realm. What do I mean by that? Okay, children, when they're at a level of magical thinking. So what is that? What does magical thinking for a child means? It means, well, all kinds of things like word magic, or weird magical rules that aren't necessarily true. I step on a crack, and oh my gosh, that's going to cause a problem over there. So that isn't. But the thing is that young child is still, the psyche is still really has full access or partial access to the astral. When I was a child, before 5, most of my memories of that time of my life were like leaving my body at night and kind of exploring a whole realm of being. And then as I got older and had to adapt, that kind of dried up. So one thing is that realm, which is the realm of fairy tales, right? Okay, now what fairy means, fae, refers to the astral. It's a literal term for the astral. So for instance, what fairy tales are, and which is why Jung's analytical psychologists analyze fairy tales, is they describe astral dynamics, the dynamics of the astral. So there's a big difference between the reality of a whole dimension and the kind of naivety if that's the only place that you're kind of operating from. Because there is magic. My friend Hamilton, who spent like 20 years down in Peru, like fought full on sorcerer, like, where if you lost, you died. So the astral is a real realm. And let's not be, I think part of, let's say, the problem with people who've been raised, let's say, metaphysically and integral, is they don't really have a good grounding in the Western esoteric tradition. And the thing about the Western esoteric tradition, and it's also true of the Tibetan tradition, is ritual and magic is actually an important part of it, but it's a technology. So there's a difference between understanding that technology from, let's say, a rational perspective and the perspective of a child. So we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Yes, there is a whole astral dimension. And when little Billy is talking to the trees, he might be talking to the tree spirit, or he might also be talking to his own projection. And that's the thing about that realm, is like in a dream state, there is a subjective psyche. So this was something that Carl Jung he described really skillfully. He said, listen, there's a subjective psyche. There's a personal unconscious. So if you lucid dream at night and you're lucid dreaming in your personal unconscious, what you're relating to are parts of your psyche, right? And so to give that an objective reality and say, well, that's real, when actually it's not what it is. It's actually your own like mummy daddy stuff. Okay, so there's that. But for those who are walking that path, as you clean up the subjective psyche, you get to the objective psyche. And when you're lucid dreaming in the objective psyche, when you're relating to something out there, it's actually not generated from your own psychology. It's actually objectively part of the imaginal or astral or fairy or whatever term you want to give for that dimension. So to the degree that you haven't processed that unconscious material, particularly if you think it doesn't exist, and that's the danger, let's say, of like top-heavy integral, is like, oh, that doesn't exist, then of course you haven't purified that, and therefore it's true that realm for you would still be a pre-personal realm of your own personal unconscious. However, when you work through it, it would become an objective realm.
Yeah, it makes sense that to the degree that we've processed our childhood stuff is to the degree that we can see things more clearly and be able to assess teachers more clearly and understand that relationship better.
I mean, you're right. It's difficult. It's difficult to know. I do think, I do think that there's a next generation of map. I think it depends on what maps you're using, right? That's, but sacred world and the shamanic realm is real. And frankly, like, that's much more important in some ways for us to understand that now than the higher, because we need to understand what's happening to our planet and humanity at those lower levels, because it's those lower levels, if you will, where there's real disharmony and there's real sickness. So as a physician, because I've always seen myself as a physician, I think this also goes back to what you're talking about, traditions. I'm a physician. I'm a doctor, right? I study Chinese medicine. My primary orientation has always been about alleviation of suffering. And again, not maintaining a particular tradition. It's a different.
For sure. That makes sense. That definitely makes sense.
I'm enjoying it. We're getting some good stuff out here. I think that these are great questions that, I haven't had the opportunity to drill in with people. So I respect how much time you've taken studying integral and studying with Dustin. And so, you're well informed.
Yeah. No, I appreciate that. And yeah, I was hoping this could be a unique conversation because, I mean, you've had many conversations with a lot of podcasters, but perhaps because I'm more steeped in kind of this path and this tradition kind of allows me to ask some other questions. Something I also wanted to touch on, and building on the DMT being dried out in the brain, another thing that's unique about Planetary Dharma is your willingness to incorporate psychedelic medicines. I know your wife, Nicole, is teaching the Medicine Dharma course starting this fall, which will focus on using cannabis as a sacrament and ally in the inner work process. And I'm curious, what has your journey been with psychedelic plants? Are there any specific psychedelics that you have found helpful in your own process? And how do you see psychedelics fitting into the awakening and the ecosystem of practices in Planetary Dharma? I think you've kind of touched a little bit on that, but yeah, it would be great to hear a little more about that.
Well, I think the first thing is to recognize that we've had, there's been a war against Planetary Dharma. So what do I mean by that? I mean that, the tradition that I'm in contact with, we could call it the Alexandrian tradition. It's the Gnostic tradition of the West, where rationality and science is as much, it's more based on that than it is like tradition. Yeah. And alchemy was and is a very important part of that academy. By alchemy here, we mean like the recognition of the non-duality between ourselves and the world out there in terms of minerals and plants and how they interact. That's true non-duality. Right? So we would have had Christianity and the Romans not decide to destroy the mystery schools. Right, the Elysian mysteries shut down around 400 CE. I think they went for 3,000 years. So just get your head around that. For 3,000 years until around 300, 400 CE, we had a psychedelic tradition at the heart of Western civilization. So had we not lost that, the degree of the refinement of our chemistry, of our alchemy, at this point would be so sophisticated. If we hadn't have lost that tradition, right? That tradition that was interested in truth and beauty and goodness and interested in contemplative practices through the lens of their truth, and their precision and the medicines that support that we today, this would be a moot point. You know what I'm saying? It would be like any doctor, a physician like mine would have access to thousands of compounds supporting different states and different levels of realization. So we got to recognize like where we are and why we're here, right? We would be, to the extent that even we would be like using plant medicine while we're growing the medicines to encode the medicines for particular ways of relating when we ingest the medicine. So that's where we would be. We're not there. Although we can play catch up, and we probably will play catch up. It's also an important context to recognize that psychedelics were most likely a very important part of Vedic civilization and of Ayurvedic medicine and of the medicine department at Nalanda University, from whence the Tibetan tradition came. Okay, so and there's some evidence that the Soma and some of the, there's Lama Crowley who wrote, and I don't mean Aleister Crowley.
Yeah, I know who Lama Crowley is, yeah.
So I mean, there's some people who go all in on that perspective. I wouldn't go all in on that perspective, but what I would say is the first thing is to recognize, again, from the perspective of a sacred science, right? Like, okay, there's a science here that we are rediscovering. So personally, psychedelics were part of my journey when I was younger, to some extent. My early teens, but because of the lack of academy and the lack of precision, right? I chose not to go down that road, knowing that it was a road. Like I was like, don't get me wrong, I was super disappointed. I'm like, oh my gosh, like those doors have been locked by empire, right? Those doors have been locked. So I'm going to go this other direction. And, I was blessed, in terms of the direction that I took. But along the way, I've worked with psychedelics not to the extent that some of my colleagues like Hamilton have. Right? I mean, my friend Hamilton, I think his initiation into ayahuasca was, I think his maestros, he said to me it was like 300 days of drinking ayahuasca in a row. Okay, so what does that do? That opens up the astral, and if there's any pre-trance fallacy, by the end, you've worked through that, right? So, but along my journey, yes, whether it's been cannabis to some extent, LSD at some points, MDMA, DMT, ayahuasca, some mushroom. But because of the amount of practice I've had, my system is super sensitive. And so for me, like there is no recreational cannabis.
I hear that.
Okay. So it's all medicine and all to be like super respected. So when I say those, like I've done these substances, it's not like recreationally. Okay. So they're super supportive. They could be super, super supportive, particularly with working with trauma, right? And stabilizing, learning to, from a psychodynamic perspective, opening up and bringing material up. From a kind of energetic perspective, if you're particularly dry, maybe like increasing the moistness of the brain so that you can experience the energetic dimensions a little easier. From the perspective of Dzogchen and Mahamudra, like how stable is your view? Right? Like not everybody has the opportunity to do dark retreat, which often in, let's say, the Dzogchen tradition was a good way of seeing how stable your view is. And having done a little dark retreat, what I'd say is it takes maybe 3 or 4 days to get things going, when with ayahuasca, it takes, doesn't take. So all of these medicines understood the right way. So I think the point of medicine Dharma is to start to educate people on how do we relate to these medicines in the right way, and also how do we become practitioners? What are the ritual containers necessary, right? And how do we not misuse them, and how do we learn to relate to them? Starting with cannabis, which of course has had unfortunate PR for the last 100 years. Right, it's been seen as a weed, as opposed to perhaps a form of intelligence. Of course, here in Colorado, where it's all legal, the degree of, let's say, research into the terpenes and the whole makeup of cannabis has really been revealed. Right, so Nicole often will blend up to 10 to 15 different forms of cannabis for the terpene profile, because the THC is like the engine that takes you, but the terpenes are what defines the nature of where you're going. So there's a whole alchemy arising. I think that's why we're starting, if you will, with cannabis, because of the nature of the amount of science and so the degree of intentionality that we can have when we're relating to that planet is significant. The plant.
The plant, yeah.
Is significant. Did you have any more questions about that?
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I mean, I guess, I've had different psychedelic experiences too with ayahuasca and 5-MeO-DMT. And I think there could be this thing of like people, like you said, you had psychedelic experiences early, and then at some point you're like, all right, kind of showed me what it needed to show me. But then you also have this notion of like your friend who goes and drinks it for 300 days, which, very different. It's a very different kind of like, I think for me, like having some of these experiences, like, all right, I kind of got what that was. And now I want to just focus on meditation. And I feel like there's
let me just speak to that. So that 300 days gives you full open access to the astral. That is not like that. That is a proper, if we had a full on initiatory school here in the West, that would be part of the training.
Ayahuasca, 300 days of ayahuasca.
Not necessarily ayahuasca, but like that was the tech developed by that civilization. What I mean is yes, to the extent that whether it's dark retreat, I mean, I know colleagues who've done like 400, 500 days in dark retreat. So like, I think part of it is just getting a sense of the nature of what the initiatory system really would be. Like a full Western initiatory system based on scientific principles, right? And again, this comes back to what are we designing for? That's what I'm designing for, is like what's needed here in the West for that kind of really deeply robust training. And yes, access and experience in the astral would be a really important part of that. In Peru, it was 300 days of ayahuasca, but it could be, 100 days in the dark. Right. I mean, I think it's really important that we get a sense of what is possible and what real training looks like, and that we plan for that and help build that for future generations. Because that's what we're going to need. We're going to need to mutate. We're going to need to mutate in order to like save the world needs to mutate, doesn't it? It needs to go through some. We need to go through some deep transformative process, and I don't honestly believe that we yet have the institutions built to make that happen. We're still at the very beginning. We're still at the very beginning.
Yeah. So, you mentioned that you don't have like infinite resources, or like if you had more resources, you might be capable of doing something that's on a bigger scale. I'm just curious, like if you did have more resources, how would you allocate it? How do you see building out this academy, building out this system that kind of scales further?
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. I mean, I think that it's going to happen, whether it's myself or another person. Mm-hmm. I think the first thing is we have to recognize that if we're going to build the academy, we've got to build a new culture first. So I think it's also how you go about doing it, right? So how you go about doing it. So there's also like you start with a very small team because the truth is, as I understand right now, I don't see any one teacher who's yet fully initiated, because actually to do that, we need to be initiated by our peer. There's like it's like with a nuclear reactor, or you've all got to put the key in at the same time and turn the key. So part of it is working out how, on a deep level, what's the kind of culture, if you will, of that kind of facility. So that's ritual culture design, meaning we actually have to go about and design like how you would get up, brush your teeth, like all the things that we take for granted are also included in that design tech. Because essentially it is is the day-to-day ritual that basically kind of begins to condition us. So the first level is even, let's say, getting together the team to help design that. What do we know about, what do we want that culture to be? Right? Once you've done that and you set up the kind of that system, part of it is also working on building the egregore. So building the egregore is like building the subtle level energy structure of that academy. And by that I mean, so that energetically, even if you're not able to do those extensive practices, because you're a householder, if, however, the practices that you are doing are energetically dialed into the egregore, you are benefiting. This is how like Tantra works. Fourth Turning. You are now benefiting from the nuclear reactor that's being built by the priesthood, so to speak. So you build this has got to do with fourth turning tech. Imagine, so to speak, a mandala in four dimensions that is essentially the structure of an organization. Yeah. But it's also the structure of your own subtle body. So your chakra system and the chakra system of the organization are harmonized. That's what completion stage practice does. So I actually take the structure of that organization and I bring it into my subtle body. And essentially then what we're doing is we're building an organization together. So there's a whole way that, in terms of esoteric science, that you go around building this kind of holonic institution, so to speak. But essentially, that is designed to expand to eventually become, a university planet. So, to the extent that you get the whole on right, that egregore right, it will begin to kind of digest and expand. Okay, so there's a lot of pieces here. In terms of the various departments, what kind of departments? Well, I think part of what we have right now is it's the end of a phase of the forerunners, the Dr. Dans and the Kens but there's a bunch of like super wonderful weirdos out there who are like Western people who have been like doing yogic practices all by themselves, doing 500 days in dark retreat. Like a lot of the outliers, you have to bring them back in and say, let's say, what have we discovered? Okay? What have we discovered? Because the truth is you can't nobody can do all those practices. It's impossible because of time, but what you can do is you can get the scouts to come back. We've got to bring the scouts back because think of it, that there was a scouting mission that kind of began in the 60s, right? We've got to bring them back and say, what have we learned? And then from that's at least within the kind of, let's say, the contemplative sciences department, then you begin to get a sense of, okay, like this is what happened and how you have to like, when you bring an intelligence officer in out of the cold, right? You have to, what's the word? You have to kind of you need a briefing, right? Like you need a full briefing. You need to work out what happened, what did you do, where did you go, all of that kind of stuff. That's a significant part of it because there's the new kind of technology. There's two kinds of tech that needs to be developed. One is, let's say, the temple tech, and the other one is the sacred commons. Right now, we don't really have a sacred commons. And so the sacred commons technology is essentially like what is the kind of new contemplative technology that we could share amongst all of these communities that we're part of, that is a basic agreement, a new platform, right? That is tapped into something like super potent, but is like the village level, that is democratic, that is open source. Because temple is not democratic. It's not open source. Temple tech is hierarchical. It needs to be protected. because to some degree, like, you don't want people doing things that are going to like screw them up. But how you go about doing that, there's that piece. Then, of course, there's the whole finances piece. You got to like, I mean, right now, all the pieces are coming together, like in terms of, let's say, DeFi, in terms of like DAOs, in terms of like how you might actually structure something so that the actual financial engine is holonic itself, if that makes sense. Anyway, this is a big conversation. So
yeah, no, I appreciate those pieces, though. I really like the image of the nuclear reactor and like the practitioners kind of elevating consciousness and doing these practices, but there being a connection to that, and people that don't have the capacity to practice as much can take in things by osmosis and be charged up, and maybe there's a transmission of these things. And it also made me think about the saying that the next Buddha is the Sangha, and that like maybe there was more of an emphasis on particular teachers, and now there's a decentralization process going on. You see this, as you mentioned with DeFi.
You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. The Tibet. So why not Tibetan Buddhism? Because when you do all those practices, you're plugging into the Tibetan egregore, and which is fine, but you also have to understand what that egregore is and what its function was and who did it serve. And also what its kind of operating instructions were, which was like highly individualistic practitioners, because at that moment in time, there wasn't a general level of education to bring everybody. So it was pretty individualistic, which is also why you have the emphasis on the individual teacher. Wired into all those practices and chants and all of that is actually a whole egregore. Which is great, but you need to know that the practices actually have harmonic resonance with that, with a tradition, which is fine. It's like, but they do. And the question is what kind of egregore do you want to be tapping into? Do you want to be tapping into an egregore that only got to a feudal level of like, the egregore, the Tibetan egregore is feudal. Look at, let's say, Trungpa Rinpoche. He created a kingdom. That is the level of development of that egregore. And I don't see anything that indicates otherwise, that it is being updated. And it doesn't have to be, because it was meant to serve the Tibetan people at a certain moment in time. And so, yeah, it's
yeah, a lot to ponder. With these questions for sure. So one other thing you were saying was that with any teacher that has some great ability, there could be an imbalance and like a weakness. What do you feel like is your weakness as a teacher?
I think that I made a decision when I was, let's say, what was it, 18 or something, rather than going into retreat, to do the householder thing. And the nature of raising a family, of providing, of trying to do what needs to be done in this civilization, which is super aggressive. It's a super aggressive civilization. I think I'm a product of, to some extent, I'm a product of that, right? Like, had I chosen to go the other way, although I'm actually super excited because my youngest is 16. So when he graduates, like, there's a whole nother opportunity to bring about balance. Because life conditions are very conditioning, right? That's the main condition in some ways. So it's like not having a lot of time leads to certain things, like, being able to having to do work this way. I mean, there's a lot, there's a lot, there's a lot in terms of, let's say, whatever it is that I'm not. Those are the pieces that need to be integrated. And of course, different life phases lead, like allow different fun, so I feel like I'm completing a life phase in some ways, over the next few years. And then I'm looking forward to actually going into retreat and building the kind of facility that I was talking about. That's really where, aside from planetary Dharma, like my eye is on, okay, what does that facility look like? What does that vessel look like? Not just for myself, but for those peers that I know will also need that. Because for the last 30 years, all I've been doing is just like giving, like serving. Like, so in that sense, like what I haven't been able to do is like take care of myself.
Yeah. What do you see that looking like in the future?
Man. It's so much of that has also got to do with the integration of the feminine, on a like archetypal level. So I'd like to do like, I want to do at least a few months in Doctorate. Let's just start there. Right. And also, in order to have the mind operate the way that it has to operate right now, like to do what it is that I'm doing and you're doing and the listeners are doing. I mean, God, so much.
Dark retreat is very different. It's a very different.
So much juggling. I think there's that. There's also just in terms of the amount of complexity right now, what I'm interested in doing is building. We're slowly getting there, building the systems so that, for instance, the level of concentration right now versus the level of concentration that I know that I could sit down, concentrate for maybe, 4 to 6 weeks, like, nonstop, and bring the mind up to a very, very different level, and then reestablish a new operating system from that place. Right. So like that is also like how concentrated. Right. So the concentration piece is also related to lifestyle. Like concentration is also related to conditions. Like, I get up at 4:30 or 5 o'clock every day. I can't get up any earlier.
They just stay up all night.
I'd fry myself. So to the extent that I can personally, let's say, move into the next life phase, which is part of the wheel of Dharma, that would be like, at a certain phase, you move from being a householder to being kind of semi-retired. Not that you're being semi-retired, you're semi-retired from the world so that you can then focus on, what that phase of life is asking me to focus on. So, like I imagine lots of body work, lots of, I do want to, I'm really interested in the whole, it's interesting. It's both sides. On one side, deep embodiment. On the other side, I really want to work on some of the breatharian practices because I've had, I've fasted for a couple of weeks, water fasted. I'm pretty good with that. And there's a whole bunch of physiological shifts that happen when you begin to recognize you can run the body mind on a substrate of photons. So there's a whole, like, I'm a scientist, like the scientist part of me, right, has not got to do the kind of science that he would like to do. And why would I want to do that? Well, it's not because it's not because, let's say, like rainbow body in itself is interesting. But what is interesting for me is if you understand that the body is photonic, then you can, when you come back to functioning right now, to the extent that we can integrate that level of understanding into our medicine, we could extend life significantly if we understand how, like, the deepest substrates of the body mind are sustained. So I'm really interested in all of those alchemical practices to benefit you guys. Like I'm, you know what I mean? Like I'm really interested in like all of us raising, like, like let's do this. let's build a new civilization. Let's build a new contemplative tech. Let's build the new alchemical medicines. There's no reason why we can't do that, other than maybe not having the will, not having the vision, right? So I'm, again, like, after 30 years of doing time,
putting in that work. No, this is interesting for me to hear, because I'm a father, and I have a 4-year-old and a 6-year-old, and it's like it seems like you're at that phase where it's like your kids are older now, so that will give you kind of, they're maybe going off to college, and I think I heard Nicole mention the empty nest. The empty nest. There's the emptiness and the empty nest.
And the empty nest. That's
yeah. So that phase, and kind of like there is a sacrifice in living as a householder, raising kids, having to operate with money, and there's energy and time that gets invested in that you can't take away from it. To me, this is not to discount teachers that don't have kids, but I do feel more kind of
absolutely. Like, you're right, Artem. I mean, building Sacred World, and this is what I meant, really, it's a 90-year journey, or it's a 120-year journey. I'm interested in building that. That's what I meant. Like, it's like I'm interested in, like, okay, for instance, we have, Nicole and I are holding this nonprofit with the Karuna School, which has an endorsement from the Dalai Lama. And the point there is the clearest model to build this civilizationally is you build the K-12 with a wraparound parent journey. So the point is how do we build these structures in culture so that we can all go on this journey together, right? So that when you're raising your kids, and that's a K-12 journey, you and your fellow parents are going through an integral educational process. That's also, and the kids are too. And so that primes you so that when the kids leave, then you're moving into the next cycle of life, which would be, you probably don't want to work so hard. You've given the sacrifice. There are lessons to be learned about sacrifice that it's very difficult to learn without sacrificing for another person. You're absolutely right. Like, it's a unique kind of, it's a very human. I mean, this is what I mean by sacred humanism. It isn't that the tech is not the issue. We have all the tech. We have all the tech to rainbow body. That isn't the issue. What's issue is the humanity of understanding, like, how do we put this together in a living way that serves our lives and our children's lives and our pups and the planet itself. That's the piece that we need to try and understand, and work and do, not just understand but do. And I have every trust and faith, myself, my good friend Dustin, and all the other teachers and people like yourself and the listeners out there. We can do it. Like, we can do this. Like, we can do this. There is a beautiful, and true and good world that we can give birth to. We're just gonna have to go through a very deep transformative process.
Yeah, going down, that ensoulment, really going down into the earth, into the roots, and I'm excited for your journey also, and like kind of what the spaces you'll be able to step into as you kind of move into the next phase in your life. And yeah, I mean, I really appreciate your vision. I feel like you bring in like this really big picture, and you bring in a lot of threads together. And I think it inspires a lot of people. There's a lot of people on the ground, and it's going to take a lot of people to kind of build all these pieces out. And hopefully we're doing something with this conversation and just putting it out there. I know it's touching people. And
well, Bill, I mean, I think part of it, Artem, is also building into the field the possibility and the ideas is a part of building what we need to build. But like first, we have to even be able to think about it, talk about it,
imagine it,
right? So what you're doing is, it's really important to have these conversations. It's really important for our listeners to listen and to think about it, and to also imagine, right, what's possible. And because the imagination is informed by all the dimensions of the sacred. It's not just pre, it's also trans.
Absolutely. Well, John, this has been a fascinating conversation. I really enjoyed myself. We spoke a lot about your vision for planetary Dharma, Fourth Turning, shared a little bit of my experience engaging with your intro course, spoke about kind of your, differences with Dan Brown and kind of the polarity between traditional and more of kind of progressive lens. And of course, the transrational psychedelics. I mean, there was so much we spoke about here. Is there anything you feel we haven't covered around planetary Dharma or in general that you feel is important to mention to listeners before we wrap up this conversation?
That's really kind of you. What we're offering at Planetary Dharma is really a training in the developmental psychology and processes of what it means to grow into becoming a Bodhisattva. Right? So that has a certain kind of psychology to it, developmentally, contemplative practices that are also aligned with that. So that's, I think I want folks to understand that we offer that. There's every year there's a new cohort, and of course we offer, workshops, and there's other ways of kind of coming in contact with what we're doing. And as you mentioned, we're offering medicine Dharma, which is also, you can engage in just the kind of psychedelic component of that. I think this is obviously an invitation for those who are interested in what it is that I've been talking about. Please come check us out, planetaryDharma.com. And we'd love to have you join us. And if you don't, then please go forth and find, really good teachers and do the work in any of the number of ways that can happen.
Yeah, thank you. I will definitely include all the links to your stuff in the show notes. And John, thanks a lot. Really appreciate you coming on.
Yeah, thank you.